This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Hey friends, this is Audie Cornish, host of CNN This Morning and The Assignment, and guess what? Every story you care about, every angle you want unpacked is now streaming on CNN. That means you can catch my show or other CNN programming whenever you want on your favorite device. And a subscription also gets you access to exclusive video series and unlimited articles. So subscribe to CNN at cnn.com/subscription.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week we're trying to survive the woodland point-and-click horrors of Last Report from developer Monopixel Games. Taking on the role of a park ranger, the player's evening of filing paperwork on a particularly dark and stormy night takes a sinister turn as strange radio reports start coming in and unexpected visitors come calling at the ranger station. And players uncover the secrets of the woods before they become consumed by them. Only time will tell. So Neil, we might as well kind of dub 2025 as the year of the point-and-click pixel horror games over here on Safe Room, considering how frequently we've been covering this genre, which has been kind of like a nice, I suppose, like departure from the norm. You know, we've played lots of these types of games for horror bites. It's much more common over there, but to actually like get to dedicate some significant coverage this year to full-fledged point and click horror games has been a nice change of pace, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think we'll probably talk about it more when we come to year's end about why that is, I think. And maybe but I do think the underlying hint here is age. Yeah, like I think it's just like it. I think there's a kind of experience that works quite well and is like easier to get into in the horror space now, which is that you do have horror games that work that sort of medium level between a reading or a movie watching experience and a video game, and they're not relaxed, but they're not as intensive as say like playing Silent Hill F, where you are smacking shit up constantly, and but you can still get like the psychological horrors, and you can do cool different things in small settings. And I think this game, especially, we've got something that ties in with one of our other annual sort of favorites, which is the workplace horror as well. So the menial jobs, if you will. So it's basically forming a sort of amorphous blob of different sort of horror game styles, and this game's got a few of them in there.
Yeah, it's checking a lot of boxes for us, and that's even before we get into the uniqueness of the setting and everything. But I guess just to kind of like set the stage a little bit for this one, because the one aspect of Last Report that really stood out to me initially was the fact that, typically for these point and click adventures, they're mostly not single location setting, right? It's usually, there's the 2D side scroller kind of aspect to them. And, you're quite literally pointing and clicking around environments as you explore them. But Last Report takes place in a single room, right? Yeah. And so you're sitting at your desk, and what the player sees for the entirety of the experience is the background is the cabin door and window and whatnot. And then in the foreground, you have your desk, which you're sitting at. And, the players come back from vacation, and so they're catching up on paperwork. And so you have a stack of papers And then you've got your computer monitor and you've got your sort of like little guidebook there, basically, of rules for what it is a park ranger does. And, as you were talking about moments ago, the whole aspect of filing paperwork is just this like mundane kind of task where you basically pick up a report and you read the facts on it. And then you make sure like, okay, is this date in line with sort of like the expiration date on reports that we even look at anymore? It's, is this an expired event? Yes. You mark it as such in the computer and you move on to the next one. Or you check to see like, okay, it says I caught hunters on this park camera in section C17. And then you go into the report itself. Does it say C17? It does. Okay. So then you file it as this is accurate. And so you go through this basically like laundry list of different facts to check. It kind of reminded me a little bit of like Papers, Please, where you really have to kind of like analyze all the fine points on these different documents and whatnot. And like, yeah, that sounds pretty monotonous. That doesn't sound like the most titillating task to be doing for a game. But I think this actually ends up being one of the game's greatest strengths in regards to its, its pacing in terms of scares and whatnot. What did you think of the utilization of that POV single location setting for Last Report?
Yeah, I mean, really, that's like a throwback now when you think of like workplace horror. You have to kind of look, especially at Five Nights at Freddy's being like this thing that really made it popular in the first place.
Yeah,
and that was traditionally sitting in a room and pushing a bunch of buttons to make things happen or not happen to survive. And yeah, this kind of feels like a throwback to that in a way, that you are confined, and it's the helplessness, the idea that you can't really go anywhere like that. And which, when we will get into it a bit more, like narratively, there's moments where you think, does that work for what's happening? But we will get to that. But yeah, I do like, you've got this sort of desk sort of routine where, you turn on lights, you can open doors, you can shred paperwork, file the paperwork, take a sip of your coffee. And it's these mini freedoms you have, which, when you get these narrative breaks effectively, which like you'll do a bit of paperwork and something will happen, to progress the story, whether it be someone coming in the door, someone being on the radio, something else, or you might see out the window. It's keeping you in that sort of idea of this story, like that everything is confined in a way that generally makes sense, generally works for the job you've been given, being a park ranger, night shift, not much happening. They very early on explain, they've been replacing electrical things out there, so the power's been going on and off, so you have moments where it goes dark, and that's setting things up nicely, and you sort of get slowly introduced to characters, the other rangers that are around, and really selling the idea of the size beyond where you are and making you wonder, by only giving you like slivers of information, what people tell you on the radio, what people tell you when they come in, the map, you've got the different sections, which have like a last recorded image rather than like a video feed. And because it's done in this very simple art style, there's lots of like shadow and darkness, like to sort of sell it. And I like that about it, because it did just leave a sense of wonder, in the same way that if you were reading a book, you would just, you're having to conjure up the locations in your mind, more than anything. And while you had this little locale you're in, you are having to imagine the wider world of this park and what's out there. And I like that so much about it. And just, I guess because it's so detail rich, for it in that sort of cabin area, and the way it's handled, like the animation's very simple for a lot of the characters. So when characters walk in and out the door, it is endearingly goofily, sort of like they just sort of like zoom into the room effectively, and without any animation, which is fine, because I think the general sort of style of this means that they just sort of focus on what needs to move in a certain way, and the resources are kind of spent on that, and that's more important. The routine's like really monotonous, but in a way that makes sense for it. It's enough that you have to kind of pay attention to each thing. You've got this little rating system, you know, after you've done a few, it will basically tell you how many you've done right, which feels like, it definitely feels like that sort of workplace thing of like, here's the job, we trust you to do it yourself. Oh no, look, you didn't do it quite right, sort of thing. Like that, we're checking up on you, and just constantly sort of those sort of passive aggressive. Oh yeah, come on, you want to get 100%. You want to get it all right like that, which is difficult to do because you know you have to understand exactly what can catch you out. You know, whether it be the date or the image or exactly what kind of thing it's filed under. And that's fine. But yeah, for workplace horror, you have to have that routine, and you have to sort of evolve it in different ways as the story goes on. I think for a modern one, as many of the ones we've enjoyed have, this sort of extends it a bit further. I think when we're thinking about games we cover on Horror Bites that would do this, they were 10 to 15 minutes, and you know the story was like done and dusted. Here we are, the other end of the spectrum, where it's like an hour and a half ish, you know, where you are just able to keep doing this monotonous job, like adding more reason to it, you know, as you go on, and adding more twists and turns to the whole story and the job, which I very much enjoyed.
Yeah, that's a great point about the way in which the game really is able to make the outside world, you feel connected to it, basically, right? Because if you're going to be, you know, the restrictiveness of being in a single location, I think that this is a game that allows you to feel the scope of just how large, you know, this, national park is, basically as a ranger, and having this like walkie-talkie system, but even like that park ranger sort of like watch system that we briefly mentioned, where, you know, it shows you how the park is broken up into various chunks, and then there's like one last image recorded to give you a sense of like what that area even looks like and the ways in which the game plays with that, but also that walkie-talkie to keep in touch with the various other park rangers and whatnot. Like for a game that's only 90 minutes, I was genuinely surprised at like how it's able to establish relationships and establish the scale and the scope of the park without allowing you not only to be in the outside world, but I think just, again, in that restrictiveness of being glued to a desk for the entire experience. Because, you know, we've seen that type of thing work before, but arguably, if you're going to be having a game set in, you know, a national park, inside of a cabin is the least interesting place that you could be. And so the ways in which that this game is able to like make it feel like the world's coming into the cabin itself. And again, like I think, which we'll get into, like the ways in which they're able to have the scares play out in this very kind of like limited set of, you know, actual things that you can do. But even from like the nature of, you know, the monotony of doing this kind of like menial tasks at work, they do a good job, I think, of like establishing sort of like I suppose like the feel or the sensibilities of the developers. You know, you mentioned it a minute ago as it being like charming how when characters walk in to the cabin, they just kind of like zip in, like it's a little fast forwarded almost. You know, whenever you're going to go submit a report, you have to play one of those like prove you're not AI mini games of like select all the images type of a thing. You know, usually it's buses, but here, because it's a park, it's deer. Or you have to play a mini game basically where you plant a literal plant, or these like little sort of like easy to decipher mazes. And then also like if you go through the different files that are on the computer that at the end of the day are completely innocuous to what you're doing, it doesn't have any bearing on the story, but like you can see like photos that the protagonist and one of his coworkers took on a vacation or something like that. Like just these little things that kind of like give you a sense that this is an established place with established people with relationships. And, you know, I think that it's those types of little things that like make the payoff at the end of the game when, you know, everything starts going to hell and people's fates are what they are. It has a little bit more weight to it, I think, not to say it's like drastic or anything like that, but like it's more than just, okay, another park ranger got killed by whatever monster is out there type of a thing. There's like one or two little moments where I was like, oh, okay, that has some weight to it. I'm going to miss that character. And it's a little heartbreaking when you think about, what their death means or ramifications for that, for other people in their life. And yeah, I think that this game had a good head on its shoulders in terms of utilizing that short time frame, but ensuring that the setting is as important as it should be, given that restrictiveness.
Yeah, I think as you were saying about like the location and being inside the cabin, I think it's that same wonder about anything like the dark, the ocean, the woods. The idea of something so vast and unknown. Anything could be in it. And you don't have to be out in it. To be behind, windows and still have that. I was thinking of games that do that, where you are like in a home environment, for instance, where something is outside and something is there, and like you get a sense of like it's gloomy, it's dark, and you can't really see, but there could be something, and that's a very sort of primal human thing of just what's out in the darkness, and it very much applies. And the woods are one of the best places for that because there's all this legend and folklore of like what could be out there, and then there's the very real things that could be out there, like as referenced in the game, the bears and things like that, and like getting lost in the bad weather, and that's before you add anything like supernatural, mysterious into it. It's a terrifying place if it's not respected, and these are people who are used to them, these woods. So there's a cozy, casual sort of nature to the way they talk about them, but you do get these moments of like where they do encounter the regular dangers of the woods, like that, and that's where it's like, it's like, and being night shift as well, it is perfect for that. Like I've said before on the Horror Bites episode mainly, but like having done night shifts, solo work like that, and just the anticipation of something happening when you don't want it to, and when you're doing mundane tasks, there's this tiny part of you that always wants something to happen, but like something to break it out of that mold. But you don't really want it, but it's just like it would just make it feel like more worthwhile time. And as in real life, it's punishment almost to wish that, and something then happens. So I think that's the other part of it for me as well, is that being a night shift based game, like it really does nail a lot of the mundane yet like slightly intimidating aspects of like being on your own largely for a job like that.
Yeah, I think that this game also does a good job of I suppose, if you watch the trailer on the Steam page, it reveals a lot more of sort of just like what is actually behind what's happening. And obviously, if you look even at the image for the poster image for the Steam page, it's like, it's about a monster. But I think that one of the things I liked about this was that, as you were mentioning briefly there with like the bear aspect, talks of bears being out in the woods. One of the rangers comes in and he's like, "Oh, I need to take shelter because I heard a bear." And then the protagonist has his own sort of like little anecdote about running into a mother bear one time and the dangers of that and stuff like that. But like the game hits those traditional horror arcs, right? Where something strange starts happening. You see somebody out through the window and it's like, oh, it could have just been another ranger perhaps, or something like that. Or, maybe it was an animal, there's even one section early on when like, oh, there's a new ranger that joins the staff the same day that you get back. And it's like, oh, could this guy be behind what's happening? Could that have been the person that I saw and he's just lost? Like they do a good job of kind of going through those motions of like little red herrings here and there of like what could be responsible before the game truly just like explodes into the overall sort of supernatural angle of this game, which I appreciated, I think, a lot more than I was expecting to, because at the end of the day, like it's a pretty short game. And if they got to the sort of like the punchline of it, if you will, too soon, that might have been one of those things that kind of like made this game feel like it outstayed its welcome a little bit, even at, 90 minutes long, give or take.
Yeah. I mean, there's a more grounded aspect of like horror, if you will, before the real bad stuff happens. And it's a great sort of preamble. Like that is yeah, games like this, when we're talking about the visual novel style, is like the great thing about them is that they can follow that sort of story structure of a book and the way they build up. I mean, movies do it, sure, games do it too, but I think there's more immediacy sometimes when you're in those mediums, and I think here, you have almost the right structure where it's like settling in, getting to know the characters, getting to know the routine, like little ominous, signs of what could be, like red herrings effectively as well, and like moments of danger that don't have an explanation, and then just the way it just descends into like madness effectively is just, it's exquisite, in the way it works. But yeah, I do think that we were just talking about this week's horror bite before this, and like we're talking about its pace and structure, and like getting it right when you're doing a short game. And here for me is an example of that, where it's like it's long enough, but it's still a short game, but that pacing is just right, for me. Like as we said, with this sort of game where you are just doing a lot of monotonous things, it could so easily be like, I just want to get to the story again or something like that. But it's just the right sort of nuggets of each time that you get a little nugget of story, a little thing that happens, a little bit of doing the reports, and in those reports something being different enough, that this time round, and it's keeping that variety up whilst sticking to its own consistent rule set like that, and giving you good reason to carry on.
Yeah, I think in that regard, like for a story that's as simple as it is, at the end of the day, like it is executed on in a way that I think is both aware of its structure and at the same time is like a little more respectful of perhaps that the player's time with how short of an experience it is. Just because of the fact that, like, again, you could have so much of this game being dedicated to red herrings in a fashion that, like, for me, it has those red herrings early on, but then it moves on from that and doesn't return back to it. Like, it doesn't have those sort of like fake outs again that then make you kind of think like, oh, well, was one of those red herrings actually something that could have been happening, this or that? And it just ultimately felt like the developer really understood like pacing in a way that, is not always the case with some of these types of experiences that, from what I understand, like this is that studio's first game, and, to be able to display a well-realized sort of narrative on your first effort is quite impressive. And I think it's one of those things that when you think ahead to like what they do next, makes me excited to see what other kind of like settings they can play around with and how they're going to pace a narrative to match that setting, and whatever subgenres they might dabble in, seeing how they kind of like scale the scares and whatnot in regards to those sort of traditional structures for telling stories that utilize those subgenres. But why don't we take a quick break and we can get a little bit more into the specifics of some of the scares in this game and the ways in which it's able to utilize those qualities that we've been giving it praise for, in doing so in a little bit more of a unique fashion perhaps than we might have been expecting. But we'll have more on that in a moment. And we're back from our break, and I think what we were talking about in terms of like scares and how it's able to scale them and utilization of the foreground and background, that kind of goes along with what we've been saying about, the ways in which the story is structured and the sort of like character arc or the world arc, if you will, because it really plays around with foreground and background in ways that, again, I think that like the scares are very economical in terms of like utilizing the foreground and the background. Because naturally, if you have a door and a window in the background and, it's a dark and stormy night, something's going to pop up in that window periodically, right? But it starts pretty gradually. It's like, it's a knock at the door. You open the door and it's like, oh, okay, thank God, it's a park ranger this time. But then later on, there's a knock at the door and you see a figure, and then the figure just like sidesteps and then you don't see it again. And it's one of those things where you're like, that makes you feel vulnerable. And so, yeah, and just watching like how it utilizes foreground and background, and then just seeing the ways in which that kind of like explodes in some even more drastic ways once things truly go to hell was probably one of the most impressive and unexpected aspects of Last Report that I was really kind of taken with and genuinely surprised by.
Yeah, I think you sort of touched on it before. It's like it doesn't really sort of go back, on what it's doing. It doesn't reset the bar at any point, and it just keeps pushing forward in small ways, and that escalation just gets to a point where it's like it smoothly integrates the stuff that goes wrong and weird and like that. And I think because it's that singular environment, like having this challenge of like trying to manipulate that environment in ways that work for the story, was going to be pretty tough. But they've done a great job, I think, because like it's all in the animation and the art style. And we said, whilst like the characters are generally quite simple in design, I think the animation and the work done in sort of like twisting their initial sort of setup is really good. Like I said, it's emphasis. Yeah, that's going back to what I said before. It's like the idea that you put the effort into the places that are going to have the most impact on your story, and make the rest sort of covered in darkness. So not full faces. Faces covered by hats when people come in, and animated mouths. Sort of it works. But the creature designs work as well, where they're just very lots of blacks and reds and spindly shapes and tendrils, but hey, it works, and especially with this kind of art style. But I think it's not just that; it is the sound work that is important too, which I think from like the computers, like little noises that you get used to in the routine. It's the thumpings on the door. It's the when the lights go out and later and you hear certain noises like in the darkness like that, and you're searching for something. It's unpleasant like that. And sort of going to that, and there's a one moment late on which I won't go into too much detail in, but it's one of those moments where it's dark and you're using a flashlight to sort of look around from your desk like that. You're hearing the noises, you're kind of catching glimpses of something, and something like leaps at you and at some point, and it was the first time really where the game does that to you, where you're like, oh shit, like something coming at me, and it almost feels like a game over moment, if you will, sort of thing. Because that's when I go to talk about what I was talking about before, like Five Nights at Freddy's, that's the hook was like something jumps at you, game over sort of thing. And many games have copied that, but here it's like it's part of a narrative moment. But it was a genuinely sort of surprising moment that caught me off guard like that, and the outcome of that moment as well. And the game does a couple of things after that that are not the same, but you're using that sort of space, as you said, the difference between the foreground and the background like that. And there's a bit where a character comes in and ends up slumping in front of you, and then the lights go off like that as you're doing a report, just after doing a report that basically says corpse moves or something, like, and like it's kind of setting you up for something that doesn't happen, but it's still like really creepy moment like that. And the execution of that sort of scare, of the dread feeling of like, oh shit, like is really good like that. And so like I said, prioritizes exactly where it needs to. There's a sound design, not showing everything, and just showing enough when they have to, which is, I know, very difficult in horror games because you have the power to show anyone anything you want, really. But the restraint sometimes would be welcome, and I think this is a game that uses its restraint really well.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we talk about pretty frequently, right? The notion of just like so many games we play, they lack restraint. They might start strong, but then they dive into kind of like a lot of the tropes of the genre, but doing so in a manner that just feels like overbearing, or just like such a overabundance of those types of moments that it really doesn't give the player a lot of time to like catch their breath or breathe, to the degree that it makes those genre elements lose a lot of their bite. Whereas here, as you said, like this game does such a good job in the build up to the reveal and sort of like showing what's going on that when you get those moments of like a corpse slumped over your desk or something like that, or the really truly more gruesome moments of this game, and some of the just baddie supernatural stuff that happens. And there's a lot of stuff like blending supernatural with technology, which I really like. Naturally, you've got a computer there. And there's some of the stuff there that start to get messed with via the supernatural happenings that I thought was just like a really good use of a variety of scares and a variety of tension that you can build, utilizing again the limitations and restrictions of that setting. So I think that ended up being one of the aspects too that I was like, oh, okay, technology and horror for me does not always work, but here I thought that it worked really well because that's not from the outset. It really is just kind of like at that very ending chapter. And so the restraint in those building up to that, I thought was quite good. Like you pick up one of the reports and then all of a sudden you see something that like anybody would have noticed or shouldn't have actually been there. And that is done in a way that's like, I wouldn't say it's subtle because you can't miss it, but it builds nicely. It's not immediately like a corpse or something like that. It's like little oddities. And that comes back also to like the use of the radio, I think. You get some really good creepy dialogue through that radio before, anything actually comes to the cabin itself. Like getting a report of a large group of people in the rain. It's like, okay, yeah, people get lost in the woods sometimes. And then a report comes in about, I just saw a small child running through the woods with no shoes on, like stuff like that, which I think does a good job of just, again, making the player worried about the outside world and, the inevitability of the outside world coming into that cabin. And so for me, like that ultimately ended up being very, very effective, I think.
Yeah, and that sort of gives the protagonist this sort of like thing of not caring but caring sort of thing about the job, where it's like kind of it should be weird that there's a 10-year-old child running around with no shoes on during a storm in the middle of the woods, but someone else's problem sort of thing. Because like being the sort of job it is, it's like this is my job. I'm staying here. I'm not going anywhere. And I think there's another thing narratively that I think kind of works. What I was saying at the beginning, there are moments that make kind of question, would you really just stay at your desk in this moment like that? And I think thinking back, I think it's just that moments of shock, like what else you just kind of be stock still, like that. And I think he even acknowledges, that he could have died had he not been like rescued at the last minute in one moment. Like so yeah, it is quite interesting as a way to keep you behind that desk. And I mean, it actually had some like unintentional comedy, or maybe intentional, depending on what you will look at, because of the things you can do. Especially like the drinking of the coffee. Like time that at the wrong moment, or the right moment, if you will, like that after a certain thing has happened. It's like you feel like you're a little too nonchalant about the whole thing. But also like it becomes like in a almost cosmic horror fashion, it does become like the character is basically getting drawn into an obsessive nature about finishing the paperwork and how it's connected maybe to these events and how it can help. And obviously, visually how you're shown that changes, things, and how it basically messes with their head and becomes worse and worse and worse as the story goes on. And acknowledging like, oh yeah, no, I've got to keep doing this because this is supposed to help. Like just accepting that it'll help. But I go back to the idea of this story being about someone who's kind of just wanting to stay behind their desk and not really get involved too much like that. At that for whatever reason. And that in itself feels like, well, I don't want to go out there and get involved really, like as much as there's a couple of moments of protest of like, oh, I could come and help you sort of thing. It's this kind of like, no, this seems like it's helping, like it's questionable when they go on. But it's a really cool sort of way of utilizing that narrative idea of just sitting there.
Yeah, and we don't have to get into the finale of the game, but I think for me, like one thing that I would have liked to see a little bit more, because you end up learning about an event that occurred years and years ago in not only this national park, but like the cabin that you're in. There was a disappearance and then a murder and these things, and like there's a little investigatory aspect to this game. It's incredibly brief, and it's something that if you don't solve, the game doesn't end, but you get one of two. I think there's one of two endings or something along those lines, 2 or 3 different endings. But more importantly, like I think that would have been a stronger aspect that would have maybe given the game a little more length. Not that I think it needed it, but it would have prolonged the player's time in this world and giving them something to do in the final chapter of the game once you get through the monotony of all the paperwork stuff and whatnot. Like I would have liked to have seen that expanded on just a bit. But maybe that's something that they can explore in their next game, and a variety of different gameplay options. But yeah, that was just kind of a cool aspect that you get to see briefly. Like there's a flashback that you're involved in and interacting with that environment, interacting with these supernaturally altered files on your computer and these things. Like I wish there had been a little more emphasis on that, because that aspect of it was pretty cool and seemed kind of promising. And then the experience more or less ends at that point. So I'm not going to knock the game for that, because overall I think it was a really great use of the time that it had, and overall was really enjoyed the game, and was probably one of my standout point and click horror experiences of the year. But it's just something that I was thinking about, like, well, it would have been even that much better if we had expanded on that aspect of it a bit more.
Yeah. I think it's very atmospheric, and I suppose in defense of the ending, I think the idea is you're already too far gone into what you're doing, and you're damned either way in what's going on. But yeah, it doesn't mean that you kind of want a bit more, but I think it's just because you don't really have that moment of like, well, this game's dragging on me, and I want it to kind of end sort of thing. It doesn't ever feel like that. So yeah, you do kind of just get hit with a jolt of, oh, it's over sort of thing. And yeah, it is a little disappointing as a result of that you do have to sort of finish up. But yeah, it's probably the game's fault for being, as well paced as it is before that. Isn't.
Yeah, I think to round out, something that you had mentioned was also like the sound design. The sound design here is quite good. That is as important, if not more so, when you start to think about the various, just like sense of atmosphere, but also again, you have that aspect of the dark and stormy night. Like you have the perceived protection of, the walls of the cabin protecting you from the outside world, but you might as well be out in the wilderness yourself because of the fact that, you hear the rain beating against it and the wind swaying, and, opening, like when you open the cabin door also, it just completely floods the cabin with more noise in a way that I think just like does a really good job of, again, making you feel more involved in the world or more of a part of the world than you might anticipate for a game that, again, you're riding a desk the entirety of the experience, but you almost forget that because of the fact that the world itself is just so involved and you basically get drawn into it.
Yeah, that's it. It does. That's the greatest thing about it.
Absolutely. But it's a relatively short point and click horror game, but at the end of the day, like it does a really great job of utilizing that limited amount of time, I think, in a way that, if thing that we had discovered on itch or whatever for Horror Bites, like if it had been any shorter, I think that it would have maybe come up against issues that we typically see with games that are a little too short, in that they have so many interesting ideas, but they don't get to really breathe. And this game being an example of the importance of, full-fledged releases that, are only 90 minutes or 2 hours long in some cases, but in that extra time, you really get to have a game that gets to kind of like be a little bit more engrossing because of that distinction, and really get to be developed more to the point that it's like, yeah, you don't want it to be much longer, but in that extra time, it can kind of like accomplish what a lot of horror bites that we play wish that they could, or would, eventually want to flourish into a full-fledged release. So yeah, just in, as we are inching closer and closer to Game of the Year season, it's just nice to kind of like look back and play a game that I think, generally speaking, probably flew under a lot of radars, but I was glad that we got to take some time this week to dive into it, because it's probably one of my favorites that I've played this year, as I said. So I was glad to have the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a nice dark and stormy night type of game, in terms of atmosphere especially.
Absolutely. But until next time, my friend, as always, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, my man. Till the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.